She trusts to help. We don't consider her family. My husband said at our son's engagement party. Miss Mistress Smith. Hi, welcome to my channel. Enjoy my new story.
At our son's engagement party, my husband pointed at me and said, "The guests don't need to see you tonight. You're only fit to be in the kitchen." He sneered, "Remember your place. You never belonged here." I didn't reply. I just put on the maid's uniform he prepared and disappeared into the crowd, until a voice interrupted, "Wait, are you that person?" My husband's face turned pale. At that very moment, all control slipped from his hands. "It means the world to me that you are here. To help us connect, could you share which part of the world you are from in the comments? Also, please note, this narrative incorporates fictional details for entertainment and educational impact. Any similarity to names or settings is coincidental, but the message remains highly valuable for you. The gray uniform had been lying on the foot of the bed since the night before a dull synthetic blotch against the pristine white Egyptian cotton sheets. It was a heavy, lifeless thing made of cheap polyester designed for utility and invisibility. I had put it there myself, smoothing the fabric with a cold, steady hand before the moon had even reached its peak. In the silence of the night, I had studied it, knowing that this garment would be the most important costume I had ever worn in 35 years of public life. That was the part Richard would never understand, not that morning, and certainly not ever. In his mind, the uniform was a symbol of my ultimate submission, a tactical move to erase me from the high society circles we moved in. He thought the uniform was his brilliant idea born from his need to control the narrative. He thought everything was his idea. For 3.5 decades, that particular misconception had been the rotting foundation of our marriage, a pillar of arrogance upon which he had built his entire world. I saw no reason to correct it. Not yet. There is a specific kind of power in being underestimated, and I had spent half a lifetime cultivating it like a rare poisonous flower. It was exactly 7 in the morning. The October light was just beginning to pierce through the heavy midnight blue silk curtains of our master bedroom in Newport. It had that particular quality I had always loved about autumn in Rhode Island, soft golden, and carrying the sharp salt-scrubbed scent of the Atlantic through the ancient window frames. It was the kind of morning that felt strangely deceptive. It was beautiful enough to make you believe for a fleeting, foolish moment that the past could be forgiven and the future was still a wide, open road. I stood in front of the full-length mahogany mirror and looked at the woman looking back at me. 60 years old. I studied the silver at my temples, a frost that I had stopped fighting sometime around my 54th birthday. I looked at the crow's feet etched at the corners of my eyes, deep-set tracks earned from decades of squinting into complex spreadsheets, internal audits, and board documents that no one in this house knew I read. I saw my mother's high, sharp cheekbones and my father's legendary stubbornness in the set of my jaw, but underneath those familiar features, there was something else, something that had been quietly hardening, turning from soft flesh into cold, unbreakable flint for the better part of 6 months. My mind drifted back to Eleanor Whitfield. She was 25 years old, standing in a different mirror in a different house in Cambridge, getting ready for a different kind of night. She had been a girl of sharp intellect and a dangerously soft heart, a girl who believed with the particular fragile certainty of youth that love was a sturdy enough foundation to build a life on. She believed that a good man would recognize a good woman. She believed that the future had a way of rewarding those who possessed the most patience. She'd been patient, all right. She had been the silence behind his noise, the stability behind his chaos, and the invisible hand that steered the Sterling Empire while he preened on the deck for the cameras and the trade journals. The bedroom door opened without a knock. Richard didn't knock anymore. I wasn't sure when that small, basic courtesy had stopped, only that it had vanishing like so many other graces over the years. It happened quietly without announcement, until one day you looked around and realized the rooms of your life were entirely empty of respect. He was already fully dressed. looking every bit the successful CEO. His gold cufflinks were in his navy blazer, was perfectly tailored, and he was staring at his Patek Philippe before he even registered that I was standing there. "The guests don't need to see you tonight, Eleanor." His voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering instructions to a junior staff member, devoid of any warmth or shared history. "You haven't been yourself lately. You're forgetful, tired. It's better this way. Stay in the kitchen, supervise the catering team. That's where you'll be most useful." He still didn't look at me. He was too busy adjusting the time on his watch, his gaze fixed on the ticking seconds of a world he believed he owned. I understood the surgical precision of those words. Over the past 6 months, Richard had been busy weaving a new story. I had heard the whispers from friends, from colleagues, and even from the neighbors who lived 2 houses down on Bellevue Avenue. He had been telling everyone that I had been off, confused, slipping into the fog of early onset decline. He delivered these lies with such practiced concern, such a convincing, heavy-hearted furrow of the brow, that I imagined most people believed him. After all, why wouldn't they? He was the charismatic Richard Sterling, and I was just the wife who had slowly retreated into the shadows. I knew the depth of his performance because Margaret had told me. She had heard him at the club, watched him play the role of the devoted, burdened husband. But that was a story for another moment. "Of course," I said. My voice was as neutral as the gray fabric on the bed. He looked up then, just for a second, satisfied by my compliance. He saw a broken woman accepting her fate, but he failed to see the predator hiding in the gray. He straightened his cufflink, turned on his heel, and walked out. I waited until I heard his footsteps reach the end of the long hallway. Then I turned back to the mirror, picked up the gray uniform from the foot of the bed, and began to put it on, button by button. This was not surrender. Every button I fastened was a deliberate choice. A woman in a housekeeper's uniform moves through a party like furniture, seen and unseen at the same time. She hears the secrets men think are buried. She watches the subtle exchanges of power. Richard had handed me the perfect disguise and called it humiliation. When the last button was done, I opened the drawer of the writing desk by the window, the desk that had belonged to Harold Sterling, the only man who had ever truly seen me. Inside sat a manila envelope, sealed and signed 3 days ago. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. I locked the drawer and dropped the small brass key into the pocket of the gray uniform, alongside my phone and a small USB drive. Everything I needed for tonight was already in position. Every piece of the puzzle had been placed carefully over 6 months of quiet, invisible work. I smoothed the front of the uniform, looked at the stranger in the mirror, and thought, let him believe that. One more night. That was all I needed. The staircase in the Sterling house was older than the marriage. Harold had built it himself, not with his hands, but with his money and his taste. Back in 1971, when Newport was still the kind of place where old families came to remind themselves who they were. The banister was dark, walnut smooth from decades of palms sliding down it, and the portrait at the bottom of the stairs had been there for as long as I could remember. Harold Sterling, founder of Sterling Holdings, age 53 in the painting, which meant he had been gone for 12 years now, and I still could not walk past that portrait without feeling something shift in my chest. I paused on the bottom step the way I always did. The painter had captured something in Harold's eyes that most people missed, not authority exactly, though he'd had plenty of that. It was more like patience. The look of a man who understood that the most important things reveal themselves slowly to those willing to wait. He had seen me. That was the simple truth of it, and it had made all the difference. In the early years of my marriage to Richard, I had tried to be what the Sterling name seemed to require: decorative, agreeable, content to arrange dinner parties and write thank you notes while my husband flew to meetings I was not invited to attend. I had a business degree from Radcliffe. I had a mind that ran numbers the way some people ran miles automatically without effort, finding patterns where others saw only figures. I had tried for a while to pretend otherwise. Harold noticed. He noticed the way I listened during holiday dinners when Richard held court at the table, never speaking but always tracking the margins, the assumptions, the places where Richard's confidence outran his competence. He noticed that I read the annual reports cover to cover when Richard skimmed the executive summaries. He noticed things that a father-in-law perhaps should not have noticed, and he said nothing for 10 years. Then one afternoon in the spring of 2004, his assistant called and asked if I could come to his office in Providence, alone. I remember the drive. 90 minutes down, I-95, the trees just coming into leaf. My hands steady on the wheel while my mind turned over every possible reason for the invitation. Richard was in Tokyo. He didn't know I'd been asked. Harold's office was on the 14th floor of a building that still had his name on the door, though he had been easing out of day-to-day operations for 2 years by then. His private attorney, a woman named Patricia Hale, from a firm in Providence that had no connection to Sterling Holdings' legal team, was already seated when I arrived. Harold got straight to the point. He always did. "I'm establishing a trust," he said. "An irrevocable family trust. Do you know what that means?" I told him I had some idea. He explained it anyway carefully, the way he explained everything that mattered. An irrevocable trust once created cannot be undone, not by him, not by Richard, not by anyone. The assets placed inside it, his controlling interest in Sterling Holdings, the Newport property, the investment accounts would be held and protected by the structure of the trust itself. I would be named both beneficiary and successor trustee. In plain terms, the assets existed for my benefit, and upon Harold's death, I would hold full authority over how they were managed. Richard would be named operating trustee. He could run the company. He could make decisions, sign contracts, hire and fire, expand into new markets. He would have all the appearance of ownership and none of the substance of it. His authority would be real but borrowed, contingent on conditions that Harold had written into the document with Patricia's careful hand. Those conditions were simple. Richard's operating authority would terminate automatically upon documented evidence of financial fraud against the trust, upon evidence of marital misconduct of a serious nature, or upon my own decision to activate the succession clause. "Richard carries my name," Harold said when Patricia had finished walking me through the terms. "But you carry my trust, in every sense of the word." I sat with that for a long moment. "Why?" I asked. It was the only question that mattered. Harold was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I built something real and I want it to survive me. Richard will spend it beautifully. You will grow it carefully. I know the difference." I did not tell Richard about the trust. Harold had not asked me to keep it secret. He hadn't needed to. The Providence firm handled all filings separately from the company's legal structure. Richard had no reason to go looking, and for 20 years he didn't. I held that knowledge the way you hold something fragile, carefully, constantly aware of its weight. I held it through the years when Julian was small and the house was loud with his laughter, and the idea of dismantling his world felt like a cruelty I was not willing to commit. I held it through the years when Richard's indifferences became patterns and his absences became routine, and I told myself it was still better than the alternative, a broken home, a confused boy, a family reduced to lawyers and custody schedules. I held it until 6 months ago, when a phone rang and an old friend's voice came through the line, a voice I hadn't heard properly in nearly 4 decades, and what she told me made clear that the time for holding was over. Downstairs from behind the closed door of Richard's study, I heard his voice rise in laughter, a comfortable, satisfied sound. Then distinctly the words, "Tonight is going to change everything." I stood at the bottom of the staircase with Harold's painted eyes at my back. "Yes, Richard," I said quietly to no one. "It is." The kitchen of the Sterling house could feed 200 people without breaking a sweat. Harold had designed it that way back when he still hosted the kind of dinners that required 3 courses and a string quartet in the garden. By 8 in the morning, it was already running at full capacity, 12 catering staff moving between the prep stations and the delivery entrance, someone arguing quietly about the placement of the champagne flutes, Someone else asking where the backup linens had been stored. Nobody asked me. They asked the woman they thought was the house manager, and the house manager told them, and everything proceeded accordingly. That was the thing about a uniform. It didn't make you invisible, it made you legible. People see a role before they see a person, and once they've identified the role, they stop looking. I had learned that from Harold, though he'd put it differently. The most powerful person in the room, he used to say, is usually the one nobody's watching. I had spent 35 years testing that theory. The name Eleanor Sterling appeared in trade publications in the footnotes of financial filings, in the kind of quiet mentions that circulate through certain Boston boardrooms and Newport drawing rooms, enough for people to know I existed, not enough for them to recognize me across a catered party. I had made sure of that. No photographs for press releases, no panels at industry conferences. When Richard gave interviews about the growth of Sterling Holdings, I was never in the frame. It was a choice I made early and deliberately with Harold's words as my compass. Richard assumed it was modesty. He assumed most things about me that were convenient for him to assume. The truth was simpler and more calculated. A woman who controls something valuable has two options. She can announce that control and spend her energy defending it. Or she can remain unknown and spend her energy using it. I had chosen the second path. For 35 years. I had been the decision behind the decision, the margin note that never appeared in the final document, the voice in the room that shaped the outcome before the vote was taken. It had worked precisely because Richard believed it wasn't happening. And so, 6 months ago, when Richard began telling people at dinner parties and charity events that I had been a little off lately, forgetful, confused, not quite myself, almost no one pushed back. Why would they? They barely knew what I looked like. They had no framework for Eleanor Sterling except the one Richard had been carefully constructing for them, stone by stone over the course of the spring and summer. What he hadn't accounted for was Margaret. Margaret Montgomery and I had met in the fall of 1982 in a contracts seminar at Radcliffe that neither of us particularly wanted to be in. She had sat down next to me, looked at my notes, and said, without preamble, "Your outline is better than the professor's." We had been close from that point until life did what life does, pulled us in different directions, different cities, different marriages, different versions of ourselves. We exchanged cards at Christmas for a while, then we exchanged emails less frequently, then mostly silence. The way friendships sometimes go when neither person is unhappy enough to reach out and neither is quite unhappy enough to stop. She had built her own practice over those decades, corporate law, trust, and estate matters, with a specialty in what she described when I finally called her as situations where the wrong person has been holding the keys for too long. She was based in Boston now, a partner at a firm that had no relationship, professional or otherwise, with Sterling Holdings. That last part mattered. The call I made to her 6 months ago was not planned. I had been sitting at the writing desk in the upstairs study, Harold's old desk, which I had claimed quietly after his death and which Richard had never thought to dispute, and I had just finished reading a file that Margaret would later describe in her precise legal language as sufficient grounds for immediate action. I had stared at that file for a long time. Then I picked up the phone. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything. The trust structure. What Richard had been doing with the operating accounts. The name of the psychiatrist his attorney had contacted a private practice physician in Providence who had agreed in writing to prepare a preliminary cognitive assessment for a patient he had never examined. I told her about the comments Richard had been making at parties, the groundwork being laid, the shape of what he was building. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always admired about her. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I counted. Then she said, "Eleanor, it's time." She flew to Newport the following weekend. We met at a coffee shop 2 towns over where neither of us was likely to run into anyone connected to Richard's world. She brought her laptop and a yellow legal pad, and we sat at a corner table for 4 hours. And by the time we left, the outline of what would become tonight had taken its first real shape. That was 6 months ago. Since then, we had worked in the particular silence of two women who understood that the value of a plan lies entirely in its execution. The evidence Margaret had helped me gather was substantial, the kind of substantial that changes rooms when it enters them. I was checking the arrangement of the centerpieces on the main table. The florist had done good work. White dahlias and late-season garden roses when my phone buzzed once in the pocket of the gray uniform. A text from a number I had saved under a name that wouldn't mean anything to anyone who picked up my phone. In position, everything is ready. I read it once, pressed the screen dark, slid the phone back into my pocket. The champagne flutes argument had been resolved. The catering team was moving smoothly. Outside through the kitchen window, I could see the first delivery truck pulling up the gravel drive. Tonight was 12 hours away. 12 hours felt at that moment like exactly enough time. By 3 p.m, the house had taken on a different quality of noise. The morning's focused efficiency deliveries set up the quiet argument about champagne flutes had given way to something more layered. Florists finishing in the garden. A sound technician running cables through the hallway, 2 servers from the catering company practicing the sequence of the first course at a side table in the dining room. The house was filling up with the particular energy of an event that was almost ready, like a held breath about to be released. I was checking the temperature settings on the kitchen's warming drawers when Julian found me. He came in through the back door, still in his afternoon clothes, dark slacks and open collar, the same quiet way of moving through a room that he had inherited from no one in particular. Certainly not from Richard. He was 32 years old, my son, and there were moments when I looked at him and saw Harold so clearly it made the back of my throat ache. He closed the kitchen door behind him, looked at me. His eyes moved once to the gray uniform, then back to my face. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't need to. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said, which was true in the way that most important things are true, not simply not without cost, but genuinely. He nodded and leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me check the warming drawers with the patience of someone who had learned over the course of 32 years. That his mother worked better when she was moving. 2 years ago, I had asked him to come to Newport for a weekend in October. Just the two of us. I had waited until we were sitting on the back porch with coffee before I told him everything, the trust that Harold had established the operating structure, what Richard had the right to do and what he did not, and what I had begun to suspect Richard was preparing to do about it. Julian had listened without interrupting. When I finished, he picked up his coffee cup, looked out at the garden for a moment, and said, "I know. Not I suspected, not I had a feeling, I know." He had been watching his father for years the way you watch someone when you love them and are not sure they deserve it, tracking the gap between what they claim and what they are. He had seen the way Richard spoke about Sterling Holdings as though he had conjured it from nothing. He had noticed in the past year the way his father's conversations sometimes steered toward Eleanor's health, her memory, her reliability in front of people, whose opinions Richard cultivated carefully. Julian had said nothing to me because he had no proof and did not want to frighten me with suspicion. We had sat on that porch for another 2 hours talking through what we knew and what we would need to know. He had asked only one question at the end. "What do you need from me?" That was Julian. Not what are you going to do, not are you sure about this, not what happens to us if things go wrong. Just what do you need? In the kitchen, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small USB drive black, the size of a thumb, unremarkable in every way. He set it on the counter between us. "Margaret confirmed the chain of custody last week," he said. "Everything on there was obtained following her guidance. She says it's solid." The device held recordings from a small audio capture unit I had placed on Margaret's specific legal advice in a common area of Richard's office suite at Sterling Holdings, not his private office, but the conference room adjacent to it where Richard conducted most of his informal discussions. In Rhode Island, as Margaret had explained in precise terms, recording in a shared workspace where multiple parties conduct business involves different considerations than recording a purely private conversation. She had navigated those considerations carefully, and the result was a set of recordings that she believed would hold up to scrutiny. I trusted her judgment. I trusted it the way you trust the work of someone who has built a 40-year career on not being wrong. I picked up the USB and turned it over in my palm. "Are you sure about tonight?" Julian asked. His voice was even, but I knew him well enough to hear what was underneath it, not doubt. But the particular weight of a person who understands that what is about to happen cannot be undone. "In 35 years," I said, "I have never been more certain of anything." He looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. We did not hug. We were not either of us particularly given to demonstrations of that kind, something we had in common, another thing inherited from no clear source. What passed between us in that moment was older and quieter than an embrace. It was the acknowledgement of two people who had arrived at the same understanding by different roads. He pushed off the counter and straightened his jacket. "I'll be ready when you need me," he said. "I know." He went back out the way he'd come. I stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment, then reached into the pocket of the gray uniform past the small brass key, past my phone and slid the USB in alongside them. 3 small things. 2 of them had always been there. The third had just arrived. Outside, across the gravel drive, the front gate intercom sounded for the first time. The first car had reached the property. I smoothed the front of my uniform, exhaled once, and walked out of the kitchen. The centerpiece on table 7 was leaning 2 inches to the left. I had asked the florist about it twice already. The second time, she had nodded with the practiced patience of someone who had learned to agree with clients and then quietly do whatever she had planned to do anyway. I straightened it myself, set the water tube at the base of the arrangement, and moved on. It was just past 5 in the afternoon. The main rooms were nearly set. Linens pressed, glassware. Polished the long dining table laid for 40. The caterers had moved into their pre-service rhythm, and the house had taken on the particular hush of the hour before a party begins, when everything is ready and nothing has started yet. I was adjusting the last arrangement near the window that looked out over the front drive when I heard the tires on the gravel. A car I didn't recognize, black, expensive, the kind of vehicle that announces its own importance. Richard stepped out of the driver's side first, already straightening his jacket before his feet hit the ground. Then he walked around to the passenger door and opened it. The woman who got out was perhaps 30 years old. She was dressed in a way that required money and the knowledge of how to spend it. Deep burgundy fitted. The kind of clothes that suggested a very particular category of occasion. Her hair was dark and worn loose. She moved with the ease of someone accustomed to arriving places and being noticed for it. I had seen photographs. Knowing and seeing are different things, and for a moment I simply watched through the glass taking inventory. Richard said something that made her laugh. He touched the small of her back, guiding her toward the entrance. In his left hand, carried with the casual confidence of a man who does not expect to be questioned, was a small box, Robin's egg blue, the exact shade that Tiffany & Company has used on their packaging since 1845. There is not another box that color in the world of American retail. You could recognize it from 30 feet through a window, and I did. I knew what was in it. I had known for 3 weeks, ever since the audio from the conference room at Sterling Holdings had captured Richard telling someone his voice low, pleased with himself that he had found the right moment and the right piece. I had known before that in a different way. When the charge appeared in the operating account review that Margaret had helped me conduct $47,000 paid to a vendor, coded simply as a fine jewelry Newport. $47,000 of trust assets used to purchase a gift for a woman who was not his wife. 3 days ago, I had gone to the safe in Richard's study. It was a combination I had known for 20 years, the same combination Harold had used on the original safe when this had been his house. Richard had never thought to change it. He had never thought about it at all, which told you something essential about the nature of his confidence. The safe contained the usual documents, a small amount of cash, and the Tiffany's box. Purchased and waiting, the necklace inside was real. The workmanship was excellent. The center stone was a round-cut diamond of approximately 3 carats, set in platinum with a pavé band. I removed it, set it carefully aside on Harold's old desk wrapped in a cloth. What I placed back in the box was a piece I had commissioned 6 weeks earlier from a studio in Providence that specialized in high-quality costume jewelry for theatrical productions. The designer had worked from photographs. The result was to the untrained eye and in ordinary light essentially indistinguishable from the original. Then I closed the box, returned it to the safe, and left the real necklace in the care of Margaret's office in Boston, where it had been sitting in a fireproof document safe ever since, correctly classified in the trust inventory as a sterling family asset. I was straightening my cuffs when Richard came through the front entrance with the woman beside him. He saw me. His expression moved through something briefly not guilt, nothing that sophisticated. More like mild irritation at an inconvenient piece of furniture that had turned up in the wrong room. He did not introduce me. He did not acknowledge that I existed except to say as he moved past voice low enough that only I could hear, "Stay in the kitchen until I call for you." He didn't break stride. The woman Clara from the recordings from the charges and the accounts, from 3 weeks of knowing exactly who she was, glanced at me as she passed. She took in the gray uniform, the flat shoes, the absence of jewelry. "You must be the house manager," she said. "Not a question, a categorization." Richard mentioned there was someone keeping things running. She smiled, and it was a pleasant enough smile, the kind you give to someone whose name you don't expect to remember. Then she turned back to Richard, and I ceased in her field of attention to exist. I stood in the entrance hall for a moment after they had gone through toward the main reception room. The blue box was still in Richard's left hand as he walked away. He had no idea what was in it. I turned, walked back through the hallway toward the kitchen, and took out my phone. The call connected on the first ring. "They're here," I said. "He has the box." A pause, then understood. That was all. I ended the call, slid the phone back into the pocket of the gray uniform alongside the brass key and the USB drive, and went to check on the temperature of the soup. Everything was in order. The front hall of the Sterling house held a particular, almost predatory kind of light in the evening. It was the kind of glow that didn't just illuminate a room, but seemed to weigh it down with the sheer suffocating cost of its existence. Harold had installed the central chandelier in 1979 Venetian glass, hand-blown by masters whose names had long been forgotten by everyone in this house, except me. It was a sprawling, intricate fixture that transformed whatever stood beneath it into something that looked like it belonged in a museum painting. A halo of artificial brilliance that promised a dignity the inhabitants often lacked. By 7 o'clock, with the first wave of guests moving through the grand entrance, the hall had become exactly what Richard had intended it to be, a stage set for the performance of a lifetime. He'd been rehearsing this night in his head for months, perfecting the lighting, the placement of the expensive white lilies, and the precise temperature of the air. To him, this wasn't just a home. It was a physical manifestation of his ego, a controlled environment where he was the undisputed master of the narrative. I moved through the crowd carrying a silver tray of vintage champagne, and not a single person looked at me twice. That was the exquisite, bitter magic of this particular hour of a party. Guests were too busy with the frantic business of arriving, orienting themselves within the social hierarchy of the room, scanning for the familiar faces that confirm their own importance, and projecting the versions of themselves they wanted the world to buy. They reached for a crystal flute from my tray without ever registering the hand that carried it. Their fingers brushed mine, and they felt nothing but cold glass. I had made 4 complete circuits of the entrance hall in the past 20 minutes, and I could have told you the name of every person in the room, the designer of every gown, the hidden anxiety behind every smile, and the exact lie each man was trying to project. None of them could have told you mine. To them, I was merely a shadow in a gray uniform, a functional piece of the architecture that came with the house. I was standing near the far end of the hall, partially shielded by the shadow of a marble bust, when the heavy oak doors swung open once more and the Montgomerys stepped inside. I'd been waiting for this moment for 6 long, silent months. Walter Montgomery was 71 years old, and he moved through the world like a man who had long since stopped caring whether anyone was watching him, a trait that, in my experience, was the true hallmark of absolute power. He hadn't inherited his wealth. He hadn't leveraged his way into a boardroom through family connections. He had built his life from the red dirt up, starting with a small, struggling pipeline company in West Texas and expanding it over 40 grueling years into one of the largest privately held energy portfolios in the country. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried, possessing a face that had been weathered by sun and hard decisions into something far more interesting than it had probably started as. As he handed his coat to a staff member, he didn't just look at the room, he assessed it. He looked at the joints in the woodwork, the thickness of the glass, and the way the light hit the floor, the gaze of a man who knew exactly what things cost to build and what they cost to maintain. And beside him was his wife, Margaret. 40 years is a staggering amount of time. It is enough time to change the very surface of a soul. It softens the sharp lines of youth, deepens the grooves of experience, turns vibrant dark hair into a sophisticated silver, and erases the nervous hesitations from a person's movements. But 4 decades cannot change the particular stubborn set of a person's shoulders when they are paying attention and trying desperately not to show it. It cannot change the quality of someone's stillness when they are thinking hard in a loud, crowded room. I knew her the absolute second she stepped through the door. She was dressed with the deceptive simplicity of a woman who no longer had anything to prove, a charcoal blazer of perfect wool, an ivory silk blouse, and a single strand of pearls that were real without being theatrical. Her silver hair was cut short, worn with the absolute confidence of a woman who had decided that the passage of time was an asset, not a liability. She looked in every sense like the most formidable person in any room she dared to enter. This had always been true of Margaret even back in 1982, when we were 22 years old in a contracts seminar at Radcliffe. I could still see that girl in her, the one who had sat down next to me, glanced at my meticulous case notes and whispered, "Your outline is better than the professor's Eleanor. You're wasting your time listening to him." She did not look at me. Not yet. Richard moved toward them with a speed that bordered on undignified, already performing his role as the gracious Titan. He offered a warm, practiced handshake to Walter and a small, elegant bow to Margaret that managed to convey both profound respect and a subtle sense of ownership over the entire evening. I kept moving my tray level, my face a mask of professional neutrality. "Walter." Richard said, his voice boisterous and filled with a warmth that felt like it had been manufactured in a factory. "Margaret, I'm so glad you made it. The night wouldn't be complete without you." "Wouldn't have missed it, Richard," Walter replied. He'd kept his West Texas accent a slow, gravelly drawl that I suspected was a deliberate choice, a way to remind the polished men of Newport that he still had the dust of the oil fields on his boots. He looked around the hall appraisingly. "Beautiful home you've got here. A real piece of history." "Thank you. We've put a great deal into it over the years," Richard said. "We that single?" Small word felt like a physical blow against my ribs. I was close enough to hear the lie in his voice, close enough to see Walter's eyes move briefly over the intricate moldings of the entrance hall. I saw the way Walter's gaze lingered on a corner where the light revealed a slight imperfection in the stone. He was a man who had renovated enough buildings to know when someone was talking about a labor of love, and when someone was talking about a trophy they had simply bought with someone else's money. I've heard a great deal about Eleanor Sterling. Walter said, his voice dropping into a tone of genuine curiosity. "I was hoping to finally meet her tonight. Isabella speaks very highly of her." Richard's response came without a flicker of hesitation, smooth and well-practiced, a script he had been refining at every dinner party for months. "Eleanor hasn't been feeling well lately, I'm afraid. She sends her deepest regrets. She's been a bit under the weather, nothing serious, just a lingering fatigue. You know how these things go. I thought it best she rest tonight so she can be herself for the wedding." He said it with the perfect proportion of fond concern and mild, masculine resignation, the quintessential performance of a devoted husband managing a difficult domestic situation with grace. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting, delivered to the one man whose approval Richard needed to secure the Montgomery merger. Margaret said absolutely nothing. She was staring at a painting on the far wall, a landscape of the Newport coastline that had been commissioned by Harold decades ago. It was a fine piece, but Margaret had never cared for landscapes. Yet I saw the angle of her chin tilt at a very specific, sharp degree. It was the same angle she used 40 years ago whenever she was absorbing a piece of information she intended to use as a weapon in a later argument. She wasn't looking at the painting. She was listening to the hollow space in Richard's voice. I came around with a champagne tray closing the distance between us. Walter took a glass with a polite nod. Margaret reached for one, and as I drew level with her, her hand moved with a sudden, fluid grace. She didn't grab the glass first. Instead, her fingers moved to the edge of the tray, steadying it in a gesture that any observer would have seen as a guest being helpful to a staff member. But what no one else could see, what Richard, in his blind arrogance, would never have imagined were the high-up fingers that pressed briefly, firmly against the back of my wrist. It was a touch as light as a moth, landing gone before it could even be registered. But it was electric. It was a signal. It was a promise. I did not look at her. She did not look at me. She took her glass, offered a thin, pleasant smile to the room, and turned back to her husband. But I knew. The game had changed. Richard had already drawn Walter toward the entrance of the main reception room, his hand on the older man's shoulder, talking incessantly. I caught fragments as they moved away, boasts about the history of the house, the company's current expansion, the pride of a man retelling a story in which he was the only hero. Walter nodded and asked the right questions, appearing to listen with his full attention. But I had seen Walter Montgomery's eyes. He had built an empire by watching what people actually did, rather than what they said they'd done. He had looked at the 1979 chandelier, not with admiration, but with the focused curiosity of a man trying to determine if the foundation was strong enough to hold the weight. Richard didn't understand that. He had never understood the difference between a man who was impressed and a man who was simply paying attention. Near the entrance to the reception room, I saw Clara. She had already claimed the seat at Richard's right hand, the chair that for every event this family had held in 20 years of ownership had been mine. She sat there in her burgundy silk, looking around the room with the hungry eyes of an interloper. I watched Richard pull the chair out for her. I watched her sit down with the practiced ease of someone who had already decided the seat belonged to her. I took a breath. Slow. Even. My heart was a steady, cold beat in my chest. Not yet, I thought, looking at Margaret's silver head in the crowd. But soon. I turned back toward the kitchen, my tray empty, and kept moving. The evening had only just begun. Richard always knew when he had a room. It was a talent he had possessed since the first night I met him at a faculty dinner in Cambridge in 1987, the ability to read the temperature of a gathering and adjust himself accordingly, to find the frequency the room was tuned to and begin broadcasting on it. 37 years later, he had not lost the skill. If anything, he had refined it past the point of effort. It had become instinct. At exactly 8 o'clock, he lifted a crystal glass and struck it once with a dessert spoon. The sound rang out across the main dining room, and every conversation in the house came to a stop, the way conversations do when someone strikes crystal, immediately, completely, with a kind of Pavlovian obedience that Richard had always counted on. I was in the hallway adjacent to the room tray in hand, and I stopped too. I wanted to hear all of it. He thanked the guests for coming. He spoke about Julian with the practiced warmth of a man performing fatherhood for an audience, pride humor, the appropriate amount of sentiment. He talked about Isabella as though her family were honored to be joining his rather than the reverse, and the room received it warmly because he delivered it warmly, and that has always been the essential trick. Then Walter Montgomery, from his seat near the center of the table, asked a question. "Richard, how long has Sterling Holdings been operating?" A reasonable question, a natural one for a man doing his due diligence on the family his daughter was marrying into. "We incorporated in 1989, Richard said. But the real foundation was laid in the years before that when I was still developing the concept. I spent most of the mid-'80s building the framework, identifying the market gaps in private financial services, assembling the right team." He paused for effect. "It's never just one moment. Of course, it's 1,000 decisions made over years." I stood in the hallway and listened to him speak about those years, the way a composer listens to someone else perform their music and change every third note. He was not lying exactly. The dates were accurate. The company had incorporated in 1989. He had spent the mid-'80s developing a concept, which was true in the sense that he had spent them talking about ideas at dinner parties, while I had spent them at Harold's side, learning the actual machinery of financial services from the man who had built them. The 1,000 decisions he described so elegantly, I had been present for most of them, and I had made more than half. But a room full of guests eating Richard Sterling's food in Richard Sterling's house, listening to Richard Sterling tell Richard Sterling's story, was a room that was going to hear what he intended it to hear. Walter listened. His expression was pleasant and attentive. But I had noticed the quality of his attention in Task 6, the way he appraised rather than admired. He was not a man who confused eloquence with evidence. I watched his face while Richard spoke. It gave very little away, which in my experience was itself information. At the end of the remarks about Sterling Holdings, Richard set down his glass and picked up something from the seat beside him. The blue box. I had been expecting it. I had known from the recordings that he planned to do this tonight to make the gesture public, to crown Clara in front of an audience, because Richard had always understood that public acts create public realities, and he had decided that Clara was a reality he was done keeping private. What he had not understood, what he had not thought to question, was that the object inside the box was no longer the object he believed it to be. He opened it with the ease of a man who has no doubt about what he's about to produce. A murmur moved through the room, the sound of 40 people registering something unexpected. The necklace caught the light of the chandelier, and to anyone in the room who was simply watching, it looked exactly as advertised. Brilliant, expensive, the statement of a man with the means and the intention to make one. Clara's expression when he held it up was the expression of someone who has rehearsed receiving something beautiful and is now receiving it on schedule. Richard moved behind her, lifted the necklace and fastened it around her neck with the smooth familiarity of a man who had done this before in private and was now doing it again for effect. Clara raised her chin. The stones caught the light. I stood in the doorway of the hallway and looked at those stones, and I thought about the studio in Providence and the designer who had worked from photographs. And I thought about the real necklace sitting in a fireproof safe in Boston, correctly inventoried and accounted for, under the crystal chandeliers of this room in the warm, directed light of an evening party. The difference between what Clara was wearing and what she believed she was wearing was not visible to the naked eye. Under the sharp, unforgiving light of close examination, it would be another matter entirely. Richard raised his glass again, turning to the room with the satisfaction of a man at the height of his own narrative. His gaze moved across the table, across the guests, across the people who had come to witness the evening he had designed. It crossed me in the doorway. For a fraction of a second, his eyes registered the gray uniform, the tray, the woman standing still while everyone else was in motion. And then they moved on the way. Eyes move on from furniture, from fixtures, from things that have been assigned to the background and are expected to stay there. I set my tray down on the hall table. Across the room, Margaret was watching me, not with any urgency, nothing that could have been read by anyone paying attention to her, just the steady, specific look of someone who has been waiting for a signal and is checking whether the signal has arrived. I held her gaze for the length of one breath. Then she looked down at her wine glass, set it on the table in front of her with a quiet, deliberate sound, and rose to her feet. "Richard," she said, Her voice carried easily across the room, the way the voices of people who have spent decades in courtrooms tend to carry not loud but structured, with the particular authority of someone who has learned that volume is for people who haven't yet figured out how to make a room pay attention. I have a question. The sound of Margaret Montgomery's chair scraping against the hardwood floor was not loud, but in the sudden expectant vacuum of the dining room. It carried the weight of a gavel striking a mahogany bench. Every head in the room turned. The amber glow of the chandeliers seemed to tighten around her as she stood, her posture radiating the kind of absolute unhurried composure that only 40 years of navigating high-stakes litigation can produce. She didn't look at the wine glass she had just set down. She didn't look at the guests whispering behind their linen napkins. She looked directly at Richard, her eyes as sharp and unforgiving as a winter morning in Boston. "Richard," she said, her voice cutting through the lingering warmth of his toast, "I believe there has been a significant lapse in protocol. I would like to be properly introduced to your wife." The silence that followed was visceral. It was the kind of silence that happens just before a storm breaks, heavy charged and thick with the scent of ozone. Richard's smile didn't disappear immediately. It froze, becoming a brittle mask that looked increasingly out of place on his face. He laughed a short, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. Margaret, always the stickler for formality. Richard said, his voice pitching slightly higher than it had been moments before. He gestured vaguely toward the hallway, a dismissive flick of the wrist. "As I mentioned to Walter, Eleanor isn't herself tonight. She's resting." The confusion has been quite difficult lately, as I'm sure you can imagine. We thought it best to keep her away from the noise. He was good. Even now, with his world beginning to fray at the edges, he played the part of the long-suffering, protective husband with sickening precision. He looked around the table, seeking the sympathetic nods he had grown accustomed to over the last 6 months. But Margaret Montgomery did not nod. She didn't even blink. "I went to Radcliffe with Eleanor Whitfield," Margaret said. She didn't raise her voice, but she didn't have to. Every syllable was etched with the authority of a woman who dealt only in verifiable facts. "I sat next to her in every contract seminar for 3 years. I was the maid of honor at her wedding 35 years ago in this very city." She paused, allowing the weight of those decades to settle over the room. Then she extended a hand, pointing with terrifying directness toward the shadow in the doorway, toward the woman in the gray polyester uniform, holding a silver tray. "That woman," Margaret said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell, "is Eleanor Sterling. She is the woman I have known for 4 decades. She is the woman whose intellect built the foundations of the very company you were just boasting about. I would know her anywhere, in any light, and in any attire." The room didn't just go quiet. It became a vacuum. I could feel the silence pressing against my skin, cold and heavy. I watched the color drain from Richard's face, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray that matched the uniform I was wearing. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no sound came out. The polished, eloquent CEO of Sterling Holdings had vanished, replaced by a man who looked like he had just seen the floor beneath him turn into smoke. Walter Montgomery stood up then. He didn't move quickly, but there was a tectonic shift in the atmosphere the moment he did. He didn't look at Margaret. He looked at Richard, and for the first time the polite curiosity in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard appraisal that made Richard flinch. "Richard," Walter said, his Texas drawl low and dangerous, "are you telling me that you introduced the woman who holds the controlling interest of the Sterling Trust as your housekeeper? That you sat here and told us she was confused while she was standing 10 feet away serving us wine?" The question wasn't just an inquiry, it was an indictment. In the world of the Montgomerys, there was no greater sin than the betrayal of a partner, and no greater weakness than the fear of a stronger mind. I felt the tray in my hands. It felt light now, irrelevant. I walked forward, entering the light of the dining room for the first time as something other than furniture. I set the silver tray down on the sideboard with a slow, deliberate click. I didn't rush. I didn't fumble. I moved with the grace of a woman who had spent 35 years learning exactly how to carry the weight of a house on her shoulders. I reached up and unpinned the small, plain name tag that said "Manager" from my lapel. I dropped it onto the tray. Then I turned and looked at Richard. For 35 years, I had looked at this man with hope, then with endurance, then with a quiet, fading memory of love. Now I looked at him with nothing but the truth. I didn't avoid his eyes. I didn't let the fear he had tried to plant in me for 6 months take root. I stood tall, my gray hair catching the light of the chandelier Harold had bought in the house Harold had left to me. "Hello, Richard," I said. 2 words, that was all. But they carried the force of 35 years of silence breaking at once. They carried the weight of every document I had read in the dark, every strategy I had whispered in his ear that he later claimed as his own, and every night I had spent wondering if I was the one who was losing my mind. Richard staggered back a step, his hand instinctively reaching for the edge of the table. He looked at me, and for a split second, I saw it the raw, naked realization that the woman he thought he had buried under a mountain of lies was standing right in front of him, and she was more alive than he would ever be. Beside him, Clara recoiled. It was a subtle movement, a sharp intake of breath, but I caught it. She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time, and I saw the calculation in her eyes change. She wasn't looking at a housekeeper anymore. She was looking at the woman who owned the roof over her head and the jewelry around her neck. Her gaze flicked to Richard, then back to me, and the coldness I saw there was familiar. It was the look of a predator, realizing the trap had been set for someone else. She was already calculating her exit, already distancing herself from the man who was rapidly becoming a liability. Richard tried to speak. He cleared his throat, his hands shaking as he adjusted his tie, a desperate habit of a man trying to fix his appearance while his soul was being stripped bare. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking. He looked around the room, pleading with the faces that were now turned away from him in disgust. "Eleanor has been. She's had episodes. Margaret, you don't understand the strain. I was only trying to protect her dignity. I thought if she had a role, something simple to focus on." I didn't let him finish. I didn't have to. I simply smiled a small, sharp smile that didn't reach for warmth. It was the smile of a hunter who had just felt the wind change in her favor. "Protection, Richard?" I asked softly. The room was so quiet you could hear the wax dripping from the candles. "Is that what you call it?" I looked at the guests, then back at my husband. The air in the room felt different now, lighter for me, suffocating for him. The first domino had fallen, and as I watched the fear grow in Richard's eyes, I knew that the next 20 minutes would be the longest of his life. "This is just the beginning, Richard." I thought, though I didn't say it, "You haven't even seen what's in the pocket of this uniform yet." Richard opened his mouth to protest again, but Walter Montgomery had already turned his back on him, leaning in to speak quietly to Margaret. The room began to hum with a new kind of energy, a dark, electric anticipation. I think," I said, my voice steady and clear, "that the guests would like to know the truth about a few more things tonight." Richard's face went from gray to a terrifying, mottled white. He knew then. He didn't know how, and he didn't know how much, but he knew that the woman in the gray uniform was no longer playing her part. The queen was back on the board, and she had already called checkmate. In the suffocating vacuum left by Margaret's declaration, Richard looked like a man trying to catch rain with a sieve. His hands, usually so steady when holding a scotch or a pen, fluttered uselessly at his sides. He looked at Walter, then at the guests, searching for the familiar warmth of their admiration, but found only the cold, hard edges of their suspicion. But it was Clara who broke the silence first. She stood up with a sudden sharp movement that caused her chair to groan against the floor. She didn't look at Richard with the soft, supportive gaze of a partner. She looked at the room with the frantic intensity of a survivor realizing the lifeboat was leaking. Her self-preservation kicked in a reflex as old as time, honed by years of navigating her way into rooms where she didn't belong. "I don't know what kind of bitter game this is," Clara said, her voice high and trembling with a fragile kind of defiance. She reached up her fingers, grazing the diamond necklace, as if to anchor herself to the wealth it represented. "But Richard built everything here? I've seen the records. I've seen the dedication. Sterling Holdings, this estate. The legacy. It's all his. You can't just walk in here with a story from 40 years ago and try to take that away from him." She was playing the only card she had, the narrative Richard had fed her. She was defending the empire because she had already spent the last 6 months measuring the curtains for her own reign. Margaret Montgomery turned her head slowly. She looked at Clara not with anger, but with the weary patience one might show a child who had wandered into a high-level briefing. "Young lady," Margaret said, her voice dropping into a register that felt like a quiet gavel. "Do you have any idea when the foundations of this house were actually poured?" Clara blinked, her mouth opening to speak, but she found no words. She looked at Richard, a silent plea for a script she could follow, but he was staring at the tablecloth as if it were a shroud. "Richard." Clara started, her voice failing. 1987. Margaret interrupted. She didn't raise her volume, yet her voice carried to the farthest corners of the vaulted ceiling. The year Richard Sterling was 25 years old. He had a degree, a charming smile, and exactly 0 capital to his name. He was a man with an idea and an empty bank account. Margaret leaned forward slightly, the light reflecting off her silver hair. It was the Whitfield family, Eleanor's family, that provided the seed funding for the first Sterling Holdings office on State Street. It was Eleanor's inheritance that backed the initial line of credit. "I know this, Richard," she added, her eyes locking onto his, "because I was the junior associate who stayed up until 3 in the morning in a windowless office in Providence to finalize the transfer of those funds. My signature is on the notarized copies of the original partnership agreement. Yours is next to it beneath the clause that acknowledged the Whitfield capital as the sole originating equity." A ripple of murmurs surged through the long table. To my left, a couple of the older guests' men who had been in the Boston financial circles since the Reagan era exchanged glances and nodded. They remembered. They remembered the young, brilliant Eleanor Whitfield and the charismatic man she had brought into the fold. They remembered the whispers of how the Whitfield money had saved a dying firm and birthed a titan. Clara's hand dropped from her neck. She looked at Richard, and I watched the transformation in her eyes. The adoration, the practiced sweetness, the calculated allure, it all evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp calculation. It was the look of a gambler who had just realized the house had changed the rules while her back was turned. She looked at the man she had called a visionary and saw only a hollow shell wearing an expensive suit. I decided it was time to let him hear my voice, not as the woman who arranged his flowers, but as the woman who had watched him from the shadows for 35 years. "Clara," I said. My voice was calm. It lacked the jagged edges of anger or the tremors of a broken heart. It was the voice of a woman who had weighed every word for 6 months and found exactly what they were worth. Clara flinched. She looked at me, her eyes darting across my gray uniform as if she could still find a way to make me inferior. "I don't blame you for your ignorance," I continued, stepping closer to the table. "Richard is a master of the stolen narrative. He has spent 3.5 decades perfecting the art of taking credit for the labor, the intellect, and the capital of others. He told you he built this because he had convinced himself it was true. That is his particular talent. He believes his own lies so thoroughly that he expects the rest of the world to treat them as gospel." Richard finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a mottled mask of fury and humiliation. "Eleanor, shut up!" He hissed, his voice a jagged rasp. "You're confused. You're having an episode. Walter, I apologize, I am not confused. Richard," I said, cutting him off with a quiet finality that silenced him more effectively than a shout. "I have never been more lucid in my life, and I believe Walter has seen enough performances tonight to know the difference between a crisis and a revelation." Walter Montgomery stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the back of his chair. He looked at Richard with a profound, quiet disappointment, the kind of look a man gives a business partner who has just been caught embezzling from his own children. "I think Richard Walter said," his voice vibrating with a dangerous resonance, "that you owe every person in this room, and most especially your wife, a very thorough explanation. And I suggest you start with the truth, because I'm losing my patience with the fiction." Richard opened his mouth, his throat working visibly, but only a dry clicking sound emerged. He was a man who lived by the word, by the pitch, by the persuasive power of his own charisma. But here, in the light of the truth, Margaret had ignited his charisma, had no fuel. He looked small. For the first time in 35 years, he looked exactly like the 25-year-old boy with no capital who had walked into my father's office with a borrowed suit and a stolen idea. I watched Clara. She sank back into her chair, her body language shifting from defender to spectator. Her hand went to her neck again, a nervous, unconscious gesture, and she touched the pavé band of the necklace. I saw it then, a slight, unnatural wobble in the setting as it caught the direct glare of the chandelier. Under the intense light, the diamonds lacked the deep, fiery soul of the originals. They were bright. Yes, but they were shallow, just like the man who had placed them there. I didn't say a word about the jewelry. Not yet. The air in the room was electric, a storm held in place by the sheer force of our collective attention. Richard looked around, his eyes, wild, searching for a way out, a distraction, a scapegoat. But Julian was standing by the tech console at the far end of the room, his face a mirror of my own resolve. Margaret was a statue of legal certainty, and the Montgomerys, the very people Richard had spent 2 years courting to secure the sterling legacy, were looking at him as if he were a specimen under glass. I moved. I didn't go back toward the kitchen. I didn't reach for the wine bottle. I walked toward the head of the table, toward the chair that Richard had given to Clara. With every step, the gray uniform felt less like a disguise and more like a skin I was preparing to shed. I stood at the edge of the light, the center of the room, and for the first time in 35 years, I did not wait for Richard's permission to speak. "The explanation you're looking for, Walter," I said, my voice steady as a heartbeat, "doesn't start with the house, and it doesn't end with the company." I stepped toward the honor table, my eyes never leaving Richard's. He shrank back, his bravado finally utterly broken. "It starts," I said, "with the trust." I walked toward the head of the table. Every step was measured my spine straight, moving with a familiarity that had nothing to do with service and everything to do with ownership. The guests on either side of the long mahogany table blurred into a sea of silk and wool, their faces frozen in expressions of stunned voyeurism. I didn't look at them. I looked at the table where Richard sat, flanked by the Montgomerys, and the woman who thought she had replaced me. I stopped directly in front of Clara. Up close, the scent of her perfume was cloying something expensive and trendy that didn't suit the salt-air dignity of this house. She shrank back, her hand flying to the hollow of her throat, shielding the necklace as if I might reach out and snatch it. I didn't. Instead, I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a tone that was almost conversational, nearly friendly. "That's a beautiful necklace, Clara," I said. The kindness in my voice was the sharpest blade I had used all night. The light in this room does wonders for a piece of that magnitude. "Margaret, Don't you agree? You've always had such a discerning eye for fine jewelry. I'm sure you'd love to see it more closely. Clara hesitated. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, the conflict between her suspicion of me and her desperate need to flaunt Richard's devotion to the very people who had just been told she was a fraud. Pride, as it so often does in rooms like this, won the battle against instinct. She wanted Margaret Montgomery, the woman who had just decimated Richard's history, to see that his present wealth was at least tangible. With a defiant tilt of her chin, Clara unclasped the necklace and held it out. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her gaze remained arrogant. Margaret took the piece. She didn't hurry. She reached into the pocket of her charcoal blazer, pulled out a small pair of reading glasses, and perched them on the bridge of her nose. The silence in the room was so absolute, it felt structural, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to catch the verdict. Margaret turned the necklace over in her hands, her thumb tracing the underside of the setting. She held it up toward the chandelier, the faceted stones catching the light in a spray of artificial brilliance. "Richard!" Margaret said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Which jeweler did you say you used for this?" Richard cleared his throat, his hand tightening around his wine glass until his knuckles went white. "Tiffany's," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual bravado. "The flagship on Bellevue Avenue. I picked it out myself 3 weeks ago. Why?" Margaret set the necklace down on the white linen tablecloth. She didn't drop it. She placed it there with a quiet, devastating finality. "Because this stone is cubic zirconia," she said. Her voice wasn't mocking. It was worse, it was purely factual, the way a coroner might describe a cause of death. "The setting is silver with a rhodium flash, not platinum. There is no Tiffany hallmark, and the weight is entirely wrong. This is a costume piece, Richard. A very convincing imitation, perhaps, but it is glass and base metal nonetheless." A gasp rippled through the room. Clara's face went from a triumphant flush to a sickly, mottled white in the span of a single breath. "That's impossible," Richard stammered, half rising from his chair. "I have the receipt. I paid $47,000 for—" "She's right, Richard." The voice came from halfway down the table. Arthur Sterling, no relation but a man who had owned the most prestigious jewelry boutique in Newport for 40 years, was leaning forward, his brow furrowed. He didn't need to touch the piece. He had spent his life looking at the real thing. "The refraction is off," Arthur said, shaking his head. "In this light, a 3-carat D flawless from Tiffany would have a depth this piece simply lacks. It's a counterfeit. A good one, but a counterfeit." Clara looked at the necklace lying on the table as if it were a venomous snake. She looked at Richard, and the mask of the doting mistress finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The humiliation was total. She had been paraded in front of the most powerful people in the state, wearing glass and calling it glory. "You paid for a diamond necklace, Richard," I said, stepping closer until I was standing right beside him. I could smell the sweat and the expensive scotch on his skin. "I'm sure the wire transfer from the operating account was very real, but what you gave Clara is nothing but dust and silver." Richard looked up at me, and for the first time in 35 years, I saw it, the raw, unadulterated flicker of terror behind his eyes. He wasn't looking at his wife anymore. He was looking at a ghost who had suddenly developed the power to draw blood. "The original necklace," I continued, my voice carrying to the very back of the room, "is currently held in a secure vault in Boston, correctly inventoried as an asset of the Sterling Trust. It is exactly where it has always belonged, safely out of your reach." At the far end of the room, near the large digital screen used for corporate presentations, I saw Julian move. He was a shadow against the dark wood paneling, quiet and efficient. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the black USB drive, and slid it into the port of the media console. No one noticed him. Their eyes were all on the wreckage at the head of the table. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair screeching back. He was a man drowning, and he was finally ready to stop pretending he could swim. He leaned over the table, his face inches from mine, his voice dropping to a low, jagged hiss that vibrated with a desperate kind of violence. "Eleanor, stop this now! You have no idea what you're doing. You're destroying everything we built. Stop this instantly, or I swear—" I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I looked into the eyes of the man I had once thought was my partner and realized I felt nothing but a profound, icy clarity. "I'm not destroying anything, Richard," I said, my voice as steady as the foundation of this house. "I'm simply revealing what's already broken." I glanced toward Julian. He met my eyes and gave a single, imperceptible nod. The screen behind him flickered to life, a dull blue glow beginning to fill the dim corners of the room. "I'm just getting started," I said. The room went cold. Richard looked from me to the screen, then back to me, his mouth working, but no words coming out. He knew the necklace was only the tip of the iceberg, and he knew with a sudden, sickening certainty that the woman in the gray uniform had spent the last 6 months sharpening the ice. When Julian reached for the media console, the silence in the room broke like shattered glass. Richard didn't just move, he erupted. He lunged across the head of the table, his hand clawing the air as if he could physically snatch the digital signals out of the cables. His face was a mask of primal, frantic desperation, the look of a man who realized the walls of his carefully constructed fortress were finally collapsing. But he didn't reach his son. 2 men in charcoal suits, their frames broad and their expressions as immovable as granite, stepped from the shadows behind the draperies. They didn't shout. They didn't draw weapons. They simply intercepted Richard with the quiet professional efficiency of a closing door. These were not the Sterling estate staff. They were private security I had hired from a firm in Boston. 6 weeks ago, men whose paychecks were signed by my personal account, not the trust. Richard slammed into them, his breath coming in ragged, ugly gasps. "Get out of my way!" He snarled, his voice cracking with a high, thin edge of hysteria. "This is my house, Julian. Pull that out. Pull it out right now." Julian didn't even look up. He adjusted a setting on the console, his hands steady, his face illuminated by the dull blue glow of the waiting screen. I stood at the head of the table, the gray uniform still clinging to me like a weight I was no longer willing to carry. I didn't raise my voice, but in the hush that followed Richard's outburst, it resonated with a clarity that felt like the tolling of a bell. "Let him listen, Richard," I said. "It's only fair. You've spent so long rehearsing your version of our life. It's time you heard the version you didn't think I was recording." I looked out at the guests. Walter Montgomery was watching me with an expression of profound surgical focus. Margaret stood beside him, her presence a silent, legal fortress. 6 months ago. I began, my voice steady despite the cold ache in my chest. I realized that Richard was no longer content with just an affair. He'd begun to ask questions about the structure of the Sterling Trust, questions that weren't about growth, but about bypasses. His attorneys were looking for a way to circumvent the successor trustee clauses. They were looking for a way to erase me before I could ever wake up to what he was doing. I saw the way Richard flinched as the word attorneys left my lips. In this state, Richard... I continued, glancing at Margaret. Rhode Island law is very clear about the recording of conversations. It is a one-party consent jurisdiction. And since I am a primary officer of the trust that owns those offices, I decided to consent. I hired a private investigation firm, the best in New England, and with Margaret's counsel, I placed a digital footprint in the conference rooms where Richard felt most comfortable. A low murmur rippled through the guests. This wasn't just a domestic dispute anymore. It was a forensic audit of a betrayal. "For 60 days, I listened," I said, and for a moment the pain flared through the clarity. "I listened as you used the Sterling Holdings operating account to pay the lease on Clara's apartment in Providence. I watched the invoices for the jewelry you bought her. The first-class tickets to St. Kitts, the dinners at Mills Tavern, all coded as business development or marketing consults, totaling more than $340,000 over 3 years. In legal terms, Richard, that is corporate embezzlement. In personal terms, it was the price you put on our marriage. Clara sat frozen in her chair, her hands trembling so violently that the silverware rattled against the table. Richard stopped struggling against the security guards. He went still, a terrible, heavy stillness. "But that wasn't enough for you," I said, stepping closer to him. "You knew that as long as I was an obstacle. So you contacted a psychiatrist in Providence Doctor, Eris Thorne. You didn't ask for a diagnosis, you asked for a verdict. You wanted a preliminary assessment of cognitive incapacity. You wanted a paper trail that said Eleanor Sterling was no longer fit to manage her own affairs so that the operating trustee, you could take full control of the assets." I turned to the room. What Richard didn't know was that Margaret reported Dr. Thorne to the Rhode Island Medical Board 6 weeks ago. His practice is currently under state investigation. The file Richard was so eager to use tonight is not only fraudulent, it is legally radioactive. No court in this country would touch it. Richard's face was no longer red. It was a mottled, bruised purple. He looked like a man having a stroke of the soul. 2 weeks ago, I added, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. The full file on the embezzlement was delivered to the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division in Boston. The warrant for a formal investigation was signed yesterday morning. They didn't come for you tonight, Richard, because I asked them to wait. I wanted you to have your party first. I wanted you to see the exact moment your mask fell off. Richard stared at me, his eyes wide and hollow. "Eleanor," he whispered. And for the first time there was no charm in his voice, only the dry rattle of a man who had lost his way in the dark. "You spent 6 months preparing to destroy me, Richard," I said, looking him directly in the eyes. "I spent 6 months preparing to stop you. The difference is I did it with the truth." The lights in the ballroom began to dim automatically, a pre-programmed setting for the presentation. The shadows lengthened across the white linen and the expensive crystal. The only light left was the brilliant, cold glare of the screen at the end of the room. Julian pressed a final key. "I think the room should hear you now, Richard," I said. "Not the man you're pretending to be tonight. The man you are when you think no one is listening." The screen flickered from blue to black. A static hum filled the air, and then Richard's voice, erupted from the surround sound speakers filling the house, with a resonance that made the floorboards vibrate. "She's a relic, Clara. By Christmas, the doctors will have her tucked away in a quiet room with a nice view, and will have the keys to every single vault in this city." The silence that followed the first sentence was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. The 6-meter-wide screen at the far end of the ballroom flickered, then stabilized into a high-definition view of a room every guest recognized the executive office at Sterling Holdings, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston skyline. The image was grainy, captured from a discrete angle, but the clarity of the audio was devastating. It was a digital ghost, haunting the very man who had once thought himself a god in that office. Richard Sterling stood frozen between the 2 security guards, his silhouette jagged against the blue light. The guests, who only moments ago had been part of a glittering celebration, were now a silent jury in a dark theater. The video played and the subtitles scrolled across the bottom in a stark, white font that felt like a death warrant. On the screen, Richard was leaning against his mahogany desk, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. Clara sat in the leather armchair opposite him, her back to the camera. "Richard, once the competency evaluation is on paper, she won't be able to contest the trust restructuring. The Providence firm needs a signature. And once the doctor declares her forgetful and unfit, my signature becomes the only one that matters." Clara. And the operating rights. Everything transfers to you. The control, the board seats. Richard, everything. The house in Newport, the holdings, the seats on the museum board. All of it. I've spent 35 years building the sterling name. I'm not letting a relic from the Whitfield era hold the keys to the kingdom anymore. The room in Newport felt as though the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. I looked at the table at the men and women who had invested millions alongside Richard, who had invited him into their clubs and their lives. They were staring at the screen with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for a car wreck. On the screen, Clara shifted slightly. Clara. What about Julian? He's smart, Richard. He's been asking questions about the trust lately. Richard. Julian will understand. Eventually. He'll see that a strong hand is needed to guide the empire. He's my son. He'll fall in line when he realizes where the money is coming from. The video cut to black. The hum of the speakers lingered for a second before Julian killed the feed. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was an absolute heavy vacuum. It was the silence of a social circle realizing they had been hosting a predator. Walter Montgomery was the first to move. He stood up slowly, his face no longer mottled with anger, but turned a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at Richard with a gaze that stripped away every layer of the man's expensive tailoring and practiced charm. You sat at my table, Richard. Walter said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to shake the crystal on the table. You asked for my daughter's hand for your son. You spoke of legacy and honor. And all the while, you were planning to have your own wife declared mentally incompetent to steal the very assets she legally owns by birthright. Clara tried to stand her mouth opening to offer a denial, a justification, a lie, anything to stop the bleeding. It's not what it sounds like, she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. That video is... It was edited. It's a setup. Sit down, Clara, Margaret said. She didn't shout. She spoke with the cold, effortless authority of a woman who had just won a war. The original metadata has been verified by a forensic digital firm in Boston. The timeline of those recordings matches the fraudulent requests sent to Dr. Thorne. There is no edit that can fix what you both just said. Clara collapsed back into her chair, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't look at me. She looked at the door, but the two men in charcoal suits were still there, as silent as statues. Richard's arrogance had finally utterly evaporated. In its place was something smaller, sharper, the frantic calculation of a man looking for an exit in a room with no windows. He looked at me, and for a split second, the old Richard tried to surface the one who could charm his way out of a burning building. Eleanor, he whispered, his voice cracking. Think about Julian. Think about the company's stock. If this gets out, we all lose. We can handle this privately. I was under so much pressure. I didn't mean those things. I stood in the center of the room, my hands clasped loosely in front of my gray uniform. Inside my heart was a jagged mess of old memories, the way he used to look at me in Cambridge, the birth of our son, the 35 years of we that had just been proven to be him. It hurt. It was a dull, thumping ache that felt like an old wound reopening. But I didn't let a single flicker of that pain reach my face. I couldn't afford to. Not tonight. The company's stock is not your concern anymore, Richard. I said, my voice steady and cold, and Julian has already thought about it. He's the one who helped me find the truth you tried so hard to hide. Across the table, I saw Thomas Sterling, the CEO of the lead partner bank for Sterling Holdings, slowly take his phone from his breast pocket. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't look at the guests. He began to type a message with the grim efficiency of a man cutting his losses. I knew that by tomorrow morning, every line of credit Richard had ever touched would be frozen. The video had done its work. It had stripped Richard of his narrative, his allies, and his dignity. Margaret reached down and opened her leather briefcase, which had been sitting quietly on the floor. She placed 2 thick, red-stamped files onto the white linen tablecloth. They looked like heavy, blunt instruments in the soft candlelight. I walked toward the center of the room, leaving the shadows of the doorway behind. I stood before the people I had known for half my life, the people who had only ever seen me as a background character in the Richard Sterling show. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said. My voice was no longer the quiet murmur of a house manager. It was clear, resonant, and filled with the weight of the authority Harold had given me 20 years ago. There are a few things about Sterling Holdings that I would like to clarify, not for the sake of the company, but for the sake of the truth. Richard tried to speak to protest, but Walter Montgomery silenced him with a single sharp look. The room was mine. "The Sterling Empire was never a one-man show," I said, looking directly at the bank's CEO, then back to my husband. "And tonight, the management is officially changing." The visual of the red-stamped files against the pristine white linen was more than a legal presentation. It was a biopsy of a failed empire. Margaret Montgomery pushed them toward me with a steady hand, her face a mask of professional granite. I picked them up. They felt heavy, not just with paper, but with the combined weight of 2 decades of silence and 6 months of forensic surgical work. I walked to the center of the room. The guests sat frozen, their dinner forks abandoned, their wine glasses forgotten. I didn't need to shout. The house, usually vibrant with Richard's booming anecdotes, had become a cathedral of absolute hollowed-out attention. Richard has spent 35 years telling you that Sterling Holdings is a testament to his individual will. I began my voice quiet but resonant, carrying to the furthest cornices of the high ceiling. He has cultivated the image of the lone architect, the visionary who built these walls and these accounts from nothing. But in the world of legacy, Richard narratives are cheap. Only the documents remain. I held up the first file. The red stamp of the Providence Superior Court shimmered under the chandelier. This is the irrevocable family trust established 20 years ago by Harold Sterling. It was not a gift to his son. It was a safeguard for his grandson and a mandate for me. Under the terms of this trust, I am named both the sole beneficiary and the successor trustee. Richard was appointed as the operating trustee, a temporary manager allowed to conduct day-to-day business so long as he maintained a fiduciary duty of loyalty to the trust and its beneficiaries. I turned the page, the sound of the paper crisp in the silence. Harold gave Richard the title of CEO. He gave me the company. There is a fundamental difference between holding a business card and holding the deed. I looked at Richard. He was trembling now, his hands gripping the back of his chair so hard the wood groaned. That's ancient history, Eleanor. He spat, though the bite was gone from his voice. I've run this company for 20 years. I am the brand. You can't just wave a piece of paper and... I'm not waving a piece of paper, Richard. I'm executing a clause. I said, my voice hardening. The operating authority of the trustee terminates automatically upon documented evidence of financial fraud against the trust assets or a material breach of the loyalty clause. In the last 6 months, Margaret and I have provided that evidence to the board of directors. As of 6 o'clock this evening, the board has formally ratified the termination of your operating authority. You are no longer the CEO of Sterling Holdings. You are no longer even an employee. You are a guest in this house, and your invitation has just expired. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Thomas the banker stared at the file in my hand, then at Richard. The social hierarchy of the room shifted in an instant. The man at the head of the table was no longer a titan. He was a squatter. I opened the second file. This, I said, holding it toward the bank representatives, is a summary of the corporate embezzlement file delivered to the FBI's field office in Boston. It details the $340,000 of trust capital Richard diverted to fund his private life with Clara. Every dinner, every flight, every piece of jewelry he used to impress her was stolen, not from a faceless corporation, but from the trust meant for Julian's future. I looked at Clara. The woman who had been so poised, so triumphant in her burgundy silk, was now looking at Richard with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. There was no pity in her eyes, only the cold, sharp realization of a person who had hitched her wagon to a falling star. She saw Richard for exactly what he was, in that moment, a man with no title, no assets, and a pending federal investigation. The diamonds around her neck, already proven to be glass, felt like a noose. "You can't do this," Richard stammered, stepping toward me, his face a mottled, bruised color. "This house. I paid for this. The staff, the cars. You're trying to throw me out on the street after 35 years, after everything I did for you." "Harold could do it, Richard," I said, my voice dripping with a quiet, icy dignity. "And he did. He saw the man you were 20 years ago, and he made sure I had the keys to the locks you hadn't even thought to check yet. I'm simply honoring his intentions. I am the one who signed the paychecks for the staff you've been ordering around. I am the one who owns the title to every car in that garage. You haven't paid for anything in this house, Richard. You've just been using my credit." Richard lunged forward, his movement frantic and uncoordinated. The two security guards moved instantly, their large frames forming an impenetrable wall between us. He stopped heaving, looking around the room for a single sympathetic face. He found none. Walter Montgomery had turned his chair away. Isabella was clinging to Julian's arm, her eyes wide with shock, but her chin set in a way that signaled she was staying where the strength was. "Everything," Richard whispered, the word rattling in his throat. "The house tonight, the guests. You've ruined it all." "About the house, Richard," I said, glancing toward the arched entrance of the foyer. My heart was pounding, but my voice remained as steady as the stones of the mansion. "There's one more thing you should know about your protection plan." At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors of the foyer swung open. The sound echoed through the ballroom, drawing every eye away from the wreckage at the table. A man in a sharp black suit stepped into the room. He didn't look like a guest. He carried a leather attaché case and a long white envelope. As he walked toward us, the light from the hallway caught the embossed logo on the corner of the envelope, a caduceus, surrounded by the seal of the Rhode Island Board of Medicine. I recognized it immediately. It was the final nail in the coffin Richard had built for me, but it wasn't the nail he had intended to use. Richard froze his eyes, widening as he saw the logo. He took a half step back, his mouth working silently. The calculated look of a predator was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. "Richard," I said, my voice a whisper that cut through the silence. "The doctor is in." The man reached the head of the table, ignored Richard entirely, and handed the envelope to me. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice professional and flat. "From the medical board. They thought you should have the first copy." I took the envelope, the paper cool against my fingertips. I looked at Richard, and for the first time in 35 years, I smiled not with kindness, but with the terrifying peace of a woman who had finally come home to herself. The investigator from the Rhode Island Board of Medicine did not linger. He stood like a dark pillar of bureaucracy amidst the ruins of Richard's social standing. His presence a stark reminder that the world outside this gilded ballroom followed rules that Richard could not charm or bribe. I held the white envelope in my hand. It felt light, yet it was the final anchor that would drag Richard's long game into the depths. I looked at the guests. The shock of the embezzlement was now being replaced by a deeper, more chilling curiosity. They were beginning to see the shape of the trap Richard had set for me. Not a financial one, but a psychological one. For the past 6 months, I began, my voice clear and devoid of any vengeful heat. Richard has been very busy. He has been planting seeds in your minds, over cocktails at the yacht club during quiet corners of charity galas. He told you I was confused, that I was forgetful. that I was perhaps no longer the Eleanor you used to know. I glanced at a couple near the center of the table, the Hendersons. They looked away, their faces flushing with the realization that they had been unwitting pawns in Richard's narrative. He wasn't speaking out of concern, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, surgical level. He was building a dossier. Richard had contacted a private psychiatrist in Providence, Dr. Eris Thorne. He didn't want medical help. He wanted a commodity. He commissioned a preliminary assessment of cognitive incapacity, a document that was meant to be signed without a single clinical examination, a professional verdict bought and paid for to declare me mentally unfit. The murmur that went through the room this time was different. It was a sound of visceral disgust. In this circle, wealth is protected, but the weaponization of one's mind against them is considered the ultimate transgression. The goal was simple, I continued. If Eleanor Sterling is declared incompetent, her rights as successor trustee are suspended. Authority would have bypassed me and moved to a court-appointed guardian one Richard had already selected and no doubt compromised. He didn't just want the money. He wanted to erase the person who held the keys to it. Richard let out a sound, a choked, desperate laugh that bordered on a sob. You're delusional, Eleanor. I was trying to help you. The stress of the company. You were failing. I wasn't failing, Richard, I said, turning to the investigator. But Dr. Thorne certainly was. I opened the envelope and pulled out the single sheet of official stationery. This is a formal notice from the Rhode Island Board of Medicine, based on a comprehensive complaint and supporting evidence filed by Margaret Montgomery, Esquire. Dr. Thorne's license to practice has been suspended effective immediately. He is currently under a state criminal investigation for medical fraud and the falsification of psychiatric records. I held the paper up the light of the chandelier, catching the official seal. The evaluation Richard was counting on tonight, the weapon he intended to use to finalize his coup, does not exist. It is a piece of fraudulent trash. The doctor who was supposed to sign my life away is currently busy explaining his choices to a panel of his peers. I looked directly at Richard. For the first time in 35 years, I let the coldness in my eyes melt into something sharp and triumphant. I am not confused, Richard. I have never been confused. I have been awake for every single minute of your betrayal. I was simply waiting for the doctor to run out of time. A low, dry chuckle broke the silence from the far end of the table. It was Walter Montgomery. Then a few other guests followed. A ripple of quiet, cutting laughter that was more devastating than any shout. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was the laughter of a crowd watching a magician's trick fail so spectacularly that the shame became the only reality. Richard looked around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for a single soul who would stand with him. He looked at Thomas the banker. Thomas looked at his watch. He looked at the Hendersons. They looked at their plates. He was a dead man walking in a room full of people who had already moved on to the next chapter. Beside him, Clara stood up abruptly. She grabbed her designer clutch with such force her knuckles went white. Her face was a mask of sheer panic. I can't be here for this, she whispered, her voice shaking. I need some air. Richard, I'm leaving. Clara, I said. The name stopped her as effectively as a physical barrier. She turned her eyes wide, looking at me with a mixture of terror and a new, begrudging realization that she had been outplayed by a master. Please sit down, I said, my voice smooth and implacable. We are not finished yet, and I believe you'll want to hear how this ends. It would be a shame for you to leave before the final act. Clara looked at the security guards by the door, then back at me. She sat down, her body rigid, her burgundy silk dress now looking like a shroud. She was no longer a mistress, she was a witness. Richard's gaze finally landed on Julian, his son, his legacy. Julian. Richard pleaded, his voice a pathetic rattle. Tell her. Tell her this has gone too far. We're a family. You're a Sterling." Julian didn't answer with words. He stood up from the console, walked slowly across the ballroom, and took his place directly beside me. He didn't look at his father with hatred, which I think was the cruelest part. He looked at him with a profound, weary clarity. He stood shoulder to shoulder with me, his presence a silent declaration that the Sterling name had finally chosen its side. I felt a warmth spread through me, not from the champagne or the victory, but from the sight of my son standing on honest ground. Walter Montgomery watched Julian move. I saw him lean back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he reevaluated the young man he had almost accepted as a son-in-law under false pretenses. He wasn't looking at a puppet anymore. He was looking at the future of Sterling Holdings. Richard looked at the two of us, and his shoulders finally slumped. The fire of his indignation went out, leaving only the cold ash of a man who had realized that every bridge he had ever built was currently on fire. "I have nothing left to say to you, Richard," I said, my voice echoing in the vast, silent room. "But the authorities certainly do." Richard looked toward the foyer, his eyes hollow, waiting for the next door to open. He was a man in a cage of his own making, and the bars were made of the very lies he had used to build his world. Julian Sterling stood shoulder to shoulder with me, and as he turned toward the room, I realized with a sharp, bittersweet pang that the boy I had spent decades shielding from his father's shadows was gone. In his place stood a man who had finally looked into the sun and chosen the light of the truth. He didn't need the spotlight of the chandelier to look commanding. His authority came from a place Richard had never visited, absolute integrity. Julian didn't wait for the murmurs to die down. He stepped forward, his voice calm and resonant, carrying the unhurried weight of a man who was no longer playing a part. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, Isabella," Julian began, his gaze steady as it swept the room. "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond the bounds of this evening. This night was meant to be a celebration of a new beginning. Instead, you have been forced to witness a reckoning that should have happened a long time ago. I am deeply sorry that my family's reality has become your public spectacle." He turned then, looking directly at his father. Richard was panting, his face a bruised purple, looking like a cornered predator that still expected the world to obey its snarl. "Dad," Julian said, and for a second, the word carried the ghost of the boy he used to be. "I love you. I always will. But I will not build my future, my marriage, or my character on a foundation that you tried to steal from my mother. I cannot inherit an empire built on the systematic erasure of the person who actually made it possible." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just lack noise but carries judgment. Julian turned to Isabella, his expression softening, but his chin remaining set. "Isabella," he said, reaching out to her, "I'm asking to postpone our engagement celebration. Not cancel it, postpone it. I want our future to start on honest ground where our names mean something real, not something manufactured in a lawyer's office or a fraud's imagination. If you'll still have me when the dust settles, I will spend the rest of my life earning that trust back." Isabella didn't hesitate. She didn't look at her parents for permission or at the room for approval. She rose from her seat at the honor table, the silk of her dress whispering against the floor, and walked directly to Julian's side. She took his hand, interlacing her fingers with his, in a grip that was as much a declaration as any vow. "I'll still have you, Julian," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "I married into the right part of this family. I'm not here for the empire. I'm here for the man who was brave enough to tell the truth about it." A quiet, solitary clap broke the silence from the far end of the table. Then another followed, and another, until a low, Respectful ripple of applause moved through the guests. It wasn't the raucous cheer of a party. It was the sober acknowledgement of a room full of people who recognized that they had just seen something rare in their world, a moral choice. Walter Montgomery stood up slowly. He looked at Richard for a long, devastating minute, the look of a man disposing of a broken tool. Then he turned to me and gave a sharp, singular nod. Mrs. Sterling. Walter said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. I owe you an apology for the assumptions I brought into this house. We will speak again properly and with the transparency you clearly deserve. He didn't look at Richard again. He didn't acknowledge the man's existence. He had already recalculated the value of the Sterling name, and the result was standing right next to me. Richard stood in the center of the room, a void where a titan used to be. He looked at Thomas the banker. Thomas was looking at his phone. He looked at the Hendersons, his oldest friends. They were looking at their napkins. The isolation was visceral, a cold gray fog that had descended on him in the middle of his own ballroom. He was a ghost in a house he no longer owned. I felt a sharp, aching pride for my son that nearly overshadowed the 35 years of pain. He had done the one thing I couldn't do for him. He had freed himself. Richard stepped toward me one last time. The room held its breath. He stopped inches away, looking into my eyes for a full, silent minute. There was no remorse in his gaze, only the hollow, flickering rage of a man who had realized that his final trick had been seen through. Clara, we're leaving. Richard said, his voice a jagged rasp. Clara didn't move. She sat in the chair I had once occupied, her hands folded over her clutch, her face a mask of pale, frozen realization. Clara, Richard repeated. For the first time in 35 years, I heard his voice tremble, a thin, vibrating thread of fear that he couldn't hide. Clara still didn't move. She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't expected. It wasn't hatred. It was a cold, sharp acknowledgement of defeat. She looked at me and realized she had been playing a game she didn't understand while I had been the one holding the deck. She didn't follow the falling man. She stayed where the power remained. Richard turned. He walked away alone, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor as he passed through the rows of guests who had only hours ago been clamoring for his attention. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom closed behind him with a sound of absolute echoing finality. The Empire had finally and truly come home. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung shut behind Richard Sterling with a sound of definitive echoing finality. It was a dull thud that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the mansion, marking the exact second the vacuum of his presence was filled by the truth. In the following silence, as the sound of his footsteps faded on the marble of the foyer, Eleanor Sterling did something that no one in that room of power and prestige would ever forget. She did not move immediately. She stood in the center of the light, breathing in the air that suddenly felt stripped of 35 years of expensive lies. Then, her hands that had carried trays of crystal and sorted the laundry of a man who plotted her ruin, reached for the small utilitarian buttons of the gray housekeeper's uniform. She began to unfasten them. The movement was slow, deliberate, and possessed a rhythmic grace that held the room in a state of collective, breathless suspension. One by one, Eleanor undid the buttons of the gray polyester, peeling back the disguise of invisibility she had worn like a penance for 6 months. She shed the uniform with the quiet dignity of a queen discarding a tattered cloak, letting the fabric fall to the floor in a heap of forgotten service. It pooled at her feet an empty shell of the woman Richard thought he had controlled. A collective gasp, soft as a passing breeze, rippled through the guests. Beneath the gray uniform was a gown of deep midnight navy, the color of Sterling Holdings, the color Eleanor had favored since she was 20 years old. The silk was heavy and lustrous, clinging to her frame with a sharp architectural precision. Despite being hidden beneath the uniform all day, the dress was immaculate, not a single wrinkle marring its surface, as if the fabric itself had understood the importance of this revelation. It was not a new dress. As she stepped forward, the older guests in the room, those who had been part of the Boston and Newport circles for decades, felt a jolt of recognition. Margaret Montgomery pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. This was the gown Eleanor had worn for her wedding reception 35 years ago at the Whitfield estate. It had been secretly tailored by a master in Boston, its vintage lace removed, and its silhouette sharpened into a masterpiece of modern minimalist power. Eleanor had decided on this detail the very night she discovered the first embezzlement record. She would end her marriage in the same threads in which she had begun it, reclaiming the woman she was before the name Sterling became a cage. Eleanor stood in the center of the ballroom, the Newport crystal chandeliers pouring their white gold light over her shoulders. She stood in the house her family's capital had built. On the deed that bore her name before the peers she had personally gathered to witness her resurrection. Clara stared at Eleanor, and for the first time she saw the woman without the distorting lens of Richard's lies. She didn't see a relic or a housekeeper. She saw the real Eleanor Sterling, the embodiment of ancestral wealth and a razor-sharp intellect that had outplayed them all before the first guest had even arrived. The arrogance left Clara's face, replaced by the hollow, sickly realization that she had been a footnote in a story she thought she was co-authoring. Without a word, Clara rose her burgundy silk, rustling like dead leaves, and slipped through the side exit. No one stopped her. No one even turned to watch her go. Her relevance had vanished the moment Richard left the room. Eleanor did not look after her. Her gaze was steady, focused on a server standing near the sideboard. With a subtle, regal inclination of her head, she signaled for a glass of red wine. It was a vintage from the Whitfield cellars, a bottle she had personally selected months ago, a wine that required decades of darkness to reach its peak of complexity and strength. She raised the glass, the deep crimson liquid catching the light like a gemstone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor said. Her voice was no longer the murmur of a manager. It was the resonant, clear command of a leader who had found her breath again. "Thank you for navigating this difficult chapter with me. The real party starts now." Julian smiled. For the first time that night, his smile reached his eyes a look of pure, unadulterated pride for the woman standing before him. He stood up Isabella's hand still firmly in his and began to applaud. The string quartet, hidden behind the bank of palms, began to play a soaring, vibrant piece that filled the room with a renewed sense of life. The atmosphere shifted instantly, as if the windows had been thrown open to the Atlantic air, clearing out the stale scent of old betrayals. Eleanor glanced at Richard's empty chair at the head of the table. For a fleeting second, her vision blurred. A single tear escaped hot and stinging against her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. It wasn't a tear of grief or regret. It was a tear of profound, visceral release. 35 years of silent sacrifice and stolen credit had been neatly dismantled in exactly 20 minutes of truth. She felt the cool silk of the navy gown against her skin and the salt breeze of Newport on her face. For the first time in more than half her life, Eleanor Sterling was breathing for herself. She was no longer the decision behind the decision. She was the decision. She took a sip of the wine, the dark fruit and velvet tannins settling on her tongue. Her new life didn't start tomorrow morning. It started with this breath. It started now. The party had dissolved into the mist of the Atlantic midnight. The last of the town cars had whispered down the gravel drive, and the catering staff had finished their silent, efficient sweep of the ballroom. The Sterling mansion was returned to its natural state, an echoing, hollowed-out silence that felt like a long-held breath finally being released. Eleanor sat alone in the library. This room was the true heart of the house, lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled of cedar and old wisdom. It was here that Harold Sterling and I had spent hundreds of Sunday afternoons reading in a comfortable silence that Richard had never been able to tolerate. Richard liked rooms where his voice could bounce off the walls. Harold and I preferred rooms that absorbed thought. I was still wearing the navy silk gown, but the weight of it felt different now. It no longer felt like armor. It felt like a shroud for the last 35 years. In the dim glow of a single green-shaded desk lamp, I let the mask shatter. I didn't have to be the successor trustee anymore. I didn't have to be the strategic genius or the calm survivor. I was just Eleanor, and for the first time in 6 months, I allowed myself to break. I cried. It wasn't the frantic weeping of the defeated, it was a slow, agonizing leak of decades of suppressed grief. I cried for the man Richard had been in 1987, the charismatic boy who had made me laugh in the back of a Cambridge bookstore before the greed had hollowed out his soul. I cried for the decisions I hadn't made, the times I had felt the coldness creeping in and chose to call it growth rather than rot. I cried for the terrifying intimacy of waking up for 1,800 consecutive mornings next to a man who was quietly drafting a script to declare me insane. The betrayal wasn't just in the money or the mistress, it was in the stolen safety of my own home. At 4 a.m, the door to the library creaked open. Julian walked in. Still in his dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't try to offer platitudes about justice. He simply walked to the small sideboard, prepared a fresh pot of coffee, and placed a steaming mug into my hands. He sat on the ottoman across from me, his presence a quiet anchor in the dark. We sat there for an hour without a single word passing between us. He let me be broken, and in doing so, he gave me the strongest support I had ever known. By 8 o'clock, the autumn sun began to filter through the heavy velvet curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. My phone buzzed on the mahogany table. It was Margaret. "It's done, Eleanor." Her voice was crisp, the professional lawyer back in command after the emotional storm of the night before. The board of directors finalized the transition papers at 7 a.m. Richard's access to the Providence and Boston offices has been revoked. His corporate credit cards are dead. More importantly, the FBI contacted his personal attorney an hour ago. They've requested his surrender for questioning by noon. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, my voice sounding like gravel, "for everything." "Don't thank me. You did the work. I just filed the papers. Go get some sleep, Eleanor. You're the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar trust now. You'll need your energy for Monday." I ended the call and looked at the screen. There was one unread message from an unsaved number. I knew the area code. Was any of it real? No name? No signature? Just that single narcissistic question. Even at the absolute nadir of his life, Richard was still focused on the narrative. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask how Julian was. He wanted to know if the woman who had outplayed him had ever actually loved him, or if his entire ego had been built on a foundation of his own delusion. I stared at the text for a long time. I thought about the Cambridge bookstore, the early years in Providence, the birth of our son, and the long, cold winters in this house. I didn't reply. I pressed the power button until the screen went black, and then I set the phone face down on Harold's desk. Some questions didn't deserve an answer because the answer no longer mattered. I stood up, my joints stiff, and walked toward the French doors that led to the garden. The air was biting, a true October morning that smelled of salt and decaying leaves. I walked across the dew-damp grass to the far corner of the estate, where a massive oak tree stood as a sentinel against the sea. I had planted this tree during our first year in the mansion. I was 25, pregnant with Julian, and full of the naive belief that roots were something you could simply decide to grow. I remembered the sapling being so small I could encircle the trunk with my thumb and forefinger. Now the oak was a titan. Its branches spanned nearly 40 feet, a complex architecture of strength and endurance. I reached out and pressed my palm against the rough, gray bark. The tree was still there. It had survived the hurricanes, the ice storms, and the decades of silence that had filled this house. It had grown wider and deeper while I was busy making myself small. Julian stepped onto the grass behind me, his coat draped over his shoulders. He looked at the tree, then at me. "What do you want to do now, Mom?" he asked. The question was open, devoid of pressure. He was giving me the one thing Richard had tried to steal: a choice. I looked at the oak, then out at the horizon where the Atlantic met the gray sky. The victory felt hollow in the way that all endings do a vacuum where a struggle used to be. But beneath the emptiness, there was a faint, steady pulse of something I hadn't felt in 35 years. I want to find out who Eleanor Sterling is. I said, my voice caught by the wind. When she's not Richard's wife, when she's not Harold's protege, when she's just Eleanor. I turned back toward the house that finally belonged to the woman who lived in it. "I think I'd like to start with breakfast," I said, and for the first time a small, genuine smile touched my lips. A real one, in the dining room, at the head of the table. There were no more twists, no more traps, just the quiet, terrifying, beautiful reality of a clean slate. 6 months had passed since that October night in Newport, a lifetime compressed into half a year of legal filings, board meetings, and the quiet sound of a world rearranging itself. It was a crisp morning in April 2025 when I stepped into the executive suite of Sterling Holdings in Boston, not as a guest, not as a shadow, and certainly not as the CEO's wife. For the first time in 35 years, I entered this office as the chairman and chief executive officer. I walked toward the mahogany desk, the same one Richard had used to plot my obsolescence, and sat down. The leather was cool, the ergonomics unfamiliar. For a moment, it felt like wearing a garment that was slightly too large. Yet as I adjusted the height of the chair, a strange sensation washed over me. It felt right. It felt like a coat that had been tailored specifically for my measurements decades ago, one I was finally being allowed to wear in public. The past 6 months had been a relentless march of clarity. The divorce had been finalized with a speed that only comes when one party is buried under a mountain of federal evidence. The Rhode Island courts had made short work of Richard's demands. His claims for a split of the trust assets were summarily dismissed. In the eyes of the law, the embezzlement of $340,000 of trust capital was a forfeiture of his right to the spoils of the marriage. Richard had vanished. He hadn't left an address or a phone number. The last I heard, he was living in a modest apartment in a city where his name didn't carry the weight of a fallen empire. He was a man without a narrative, and in the end, that was the only punishment that truly mattered to someone like him. There was a soft knock on the door, and Margaret Montgomery walked in. She wasn't carrying a briefcase this time. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee and a stack of contracts for the new clean energy portfolio we were launching. She had officially accepted the position of general counsel 3 months ago. "The board is ready for the 10 a.m. briefing," Margaret said, leaning against the door frame. She looked younger than she had in Newport. The silver in her hair now looked like a crown rather than a burden. And Walter Montgomery called. "He's looking forward to the site visit in Texas next month. He told me to tell you that he's glad the real Sterling is finally running the show." I smiled a genuine, unhurried expression. "Tell him I'll see him in Houston." And Margaret, "Thank you for staying." "I'm not staying for you, Eleanor," she teased, though her eyes softened. "I'm staying for the work. We have 40 years of lost time to make up for." After she left, my thoughts drifted to the previous Saturday. It had been a small private evening at Julian's apartment in the North End. No crystal chandeliers, no black-tie dress code, no catered staff in gray uniforms. Just Julian, Isabella, Margaret, and Isabella's parents. We had ordered pizza from the place down the street and toasted their re-engagement with cheap champagne that tasted better than any vintage I had ever served at the mansion. There were no press releases, no strategic photo ops, just the sound of genuine laughter and the sight of Julian and Isabella standing on ground that wasn't built on a lie. Isabella had looked at me that night and said, "I think I finally understand what a legacy actually looks like, Eleanor." I I turned back to the desk and opened the bottom drawer. It was empty now, save for a single file. Inside was Harold Sterling's original will and the trust documents from 20 years ago. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, a relic of a man who had seen the future more clearly than his own son. I turned to the very last page where Harold had scribbled a final note in his sprawling, eccentric handwriting, a note I had read 1,000 times but still needed to see today. Eleanor, you were always the stronger one. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it in writing. Grow it well. I traced the ink with my finger, a final goodbye to the man who had been my only ally for so long. Then I closed the file, placed it back in the drawer, and turned the key. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside Boston was waking up in the pale golden light of a spring morning. The Charles River was a ribbon of shimmering blue, and the city felt alive with the frantic, beautiful energy of people starting their day. For 35 years, I had been Eleanor Sterling, the wife of Richard, the mother of Julian, the manager of the house, the decision behind the shadow. I had defined myself through the men I served and the name I protected. I had spent half my life making sure the world saw Richard as a titan while I remained a ghost. But the ghost had finally taken up residence in the machine. I looked at the glass of the office door, where the gold lettering had been changed just yesterday. Eleanor Sterling, chairman and CEO, no, Mrs., no Richard's wife, no qualifiers. Today, I thought watching the sunlight hit the river, I am Eleanor Sterling, full stop. I picked up my pen, sat back down at the desk, and began to work. It was more than enough. It was everything. Looking back at the wreckage of my past, I realized that silence can be a fortress, but it can also become a tomb if you stay inside too long. This family drama story is more than a battle for an empire. It is a cautionary tale about losing one's soul. God gave us the intellect to build and the spirit to thrive, not the mandate to suffer in the shadows of a lie. My advice is simple: do not be like me. Do not wait 35 years to demand the respect you earned on day one. My conviction is firm wealth can buy a seat at the table, but only integrity keeps the house standing. While this is one of those family revenge stories born from betrayal, its true purpose is restoration. When you encounter a family drama story in your own life, remember that your worth is never defined by being someone's shadow. The most powerful family revenge stories are not about destroying an enemy, but about the magnificent rebirth of oneself. I hope my family drama story serves as a beacon for those building dreams for others while their own light fades. Let these family revenge stories remind you that justice delayed is still justice won. If this journey resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel to join our community of insightful storytelling. Your engagement helps us bring more meaningful content to light. Thank you for following this journey until the very end. Please be advised. The following stories may contain fictionalized elements crafted for educational and moral purposes. If this content does not align with your preferences, you are encouraged to seek out other material that better suits your needs.
That's a story. I hope it stayed with you. I will see you in the next one.